good to see everyone here. So what I'd like to share about today is what brings us to practice and what keeps us practicing. Let's share a little reflections on that. And then also, it will be an inquiry for you, and I'll say my words, we'll sit for a little bit, and then in our discussion, you can bring forth and share, what has brought you to practice and what keeps you coming to practice. It can be a point of reflection. So what brings us to practice? This gets at, there's a word for this in the Buddhist tradition called bodhicitta. Right? It's called the way-seeking mind is the translation that I like the most. The Japanese word is hotsu, or phrase rather, is hotsu bodai shin, which I believe means raising the great Bodhi mind, raising the mind of enlightenment. We have these origin stories from Dogen and Hakuin around what motivated them in their early life, which I've recently become really intrigued by, and I'm intrigued by the differences in the two accounts. So I want to offer those here right at the beginning as something of a perhaps template for us to look at with respect to ourselves. So famously, Dogen, his father passed away when he was 2 years old, and his mother passed away when she was 7 years old. And at his mother's funeral, he tells this account, later in his life, he watched the incense from the smoke rather, from the incense on his mother's funeral altar just rising up into the sky. And he had this profound feeling of impermanence, that everything is passing. And I don't know if in his writings Dogen uses the word grief or even says he was sad. I suspect he does say that. But it's obvious that along with that sense of impermanence is this sense of profound grief that went along with this recognition of impermanence. So it wasn't a conceptual, or emotion-free recognition. It was very personal and it was very emotional. All things pass, especially impactful to us being the things that we love. This is what motivated him on his path, right from an early age. So Hakuin was very different. Hakuin, when he was 11, he attended a lecture by this monk in the Nichiren lineage, and the topic was the 8 hot hells. And it really terrified him. It scared the living shit out of him. And he actually developed this really profound fear of hell, of dying and going to hell, even to the point where, and he tells this in his autobiographical writings, there was a point a few years later when his mother was trying to get him to go into a hot bathtub, and the fire, that they used to light a fire underneath the tub in order to make the water boil. And he wouldn't go in. He just was screaming. He threw a complete temper tantrum, and he would not go in because the fire is right underneath. And all the servants in his house, I guess they were a well-to-do family, relatively well-to-do family. They were like, "What's happened? He's just going bonkers." And she eventually, calmed him down. But he still maintained this fear, and it stayed with him even until he was 23 years old. And he said, "I can't kind of live a normal life. I need to go and become a monk and pursue this." So he did, really at the, I wouldn't say he was reluctantly approved. He wasn't approved at all by his father, who didn't want him to go and live the life of a monk or to pursue a religious life. But he had to. So he did at age 23, and then his encounter with his first teacher, Shoju, who really midwifed him through his first main breakthroughs, is really interesting, because he meets this monk, Shoju, and Shoju immediately asks him, well, why did you become a monk? And Haku tells him it was because out of this terror about falling into hell. And Shoju's response to that was, you're a self-centered rascal, aren't you? And then Shoju assigns him a series of Nanto cards for him to pursue. So the way I see it, these are very different motivations. Right? You know, one is, you could say it's a very deep insight, and I don't think anyone would call Dogen self-centered for being motivated by pursuing, you know, this quality and impermanence. But you can see in Hakuin's motivation how sort of self-protective he was. Right? He was afraid that this thing was going to happen to him. Right? And he got that reflected back to him, you know, quite immediately. Now, my point is not that one is good and one is bad. In fact, both of them, you know, precipitated the rapid maturation in spiritual development of these two spiritual geniuses who still have an impact on us today. So if you are like either of these people, yay, you know, yes. If you follow through the way that they followed through, for sure. But we're talking about the motivation. So what brings you to practice? It's usually, you know, some form of suffering that we're experiencing, combined with some sense of curiosity. It might be more on the suffering side for you, or it might be more on the curiosity side. But ultimately, in my observation, if it's entirely curiosity without a sense of suffering that you're looking for, then it's likely to peter out, because this practice is too difficult to be maintained if you're just curious. So it's usually most strongly maintained when you realize that you've got a condition that is you'd like to do something about for yourself, personal condition. You know, Buddhism is a native to the US, so Dogen and Hakuin both have these very readily available gateways into the Dharma that was available to them. And so for all of us here, you know, we're all converts. And it took an extra step, you know, for us to find the Dharma, which is actually, I think, quite a blessing for us. For us to take those extra steps to adopt this foreign-born practice, if you will, means that there were some obstacles in the way that we needed to overcome in order to adopt it, and that's a good thing, I think. The Dogen talks about this aspiration to raise the Bodhi mind and how to recognize it and how to nurture it. And one thing that we can see is that it always begins with a dissatisfaction the puppy needs to be fed. A dissatisfaction with traditional motivations that our society offers up to us. Right? The traditional motivations of pretty much most, you could say, secular or non-spiritually oriented societies. right? Success, wealth, power, recognition, accomplishment, material gain. Okay. There's a recognition at some point that these are not what they are purported to be. Now you could ask, is this dissatisfaction the same as the dissatisfaction we name dukkha? This dissatisfaction. Well, this sense of dissatisfaction is recognizing something very true about these worldly things. It actually sees clearly into the impermanence of these worldly things. The fact that all success passes, all health passes, all accomplishment passes, that there's nothing substantively definitive or persistent. We just can't rely on those things, and we can't hold on to them. So that, to me, is a true seeing. And that dissatisfaction is wisdom. So it's different from dukkha. And then when we experience this dissatisfaction, our mind turns towards a way to reorient our own values in such a way that we can live a life that is fulfilling and is satisfying and is in accord with reality, which means in accord with the truth of impermanence, that everything is passing. How can we be with this truth? Instead of being in denial of it, resisting it, or attempting to compensate for it. So we have this reorientation of our values where we put understanding and realization of our true nature at the top. This is typically preceded by some kind of becoming aware of what we call the Dharma. And these teachings of the truth of impermanence and the truth of our nature. So we hear that teaching and we say, if that's true, then that's a better thing to strive for than all these other things. There has to be a glimmer of possibility, which is the initial glimmer of faith, right? So how does that develop? Well, before we talk about that, I want to talk about just how wonderful and deep this initial recognition is for each of us. In this book, How to Raise an Ox, its commentaries and translations by Francis Dogen Cook on various fascicles from Dogen's Shobogenzo, How to Raise an Ox. Cook says this about Dogen's essay on raising the Bodhi mind. The instinct to preserve, nourish, and enhance the self is so basic, so powerful, that it's almost impossible for most people to begin living life in any other way that is not a prolonged strategy for self-protection. Yeah. The instinct to preserve, nourish, and enhance the self is so basic, so powerful, that it's almost impossible for most people to begin living life in any other way that is not a prolonged strategy for self-protection. I like holding this perspective, leaving aside for a minute, what that says about people. I think it says something really important about the shift that everyone here has taken. You know, how difficult it is to make that shift, and how worth protecting and reminding yourself of throughout your life and throughout your practice, having taken this shift, how difficult it is to do that. And I believe it is difficult to do that, and I do. I look out on society and I look out on the world, and I see how many people have made this shift. Everybody in this room has, you know, but we can get a little complacent, or perhaps, you know, we think that everybody has made this shift. But I think when we look at what drives people, that it's difficult to do. So it's worth reminding yourself and protecting that inspiration that each of us have undergone. Yeah, so we start with something like that, and then in the early years of our practice, we can be really strongly motivated by this reorientation of our values, and then the progress that we make in discovering happiness where we were suffering before, or discovering some level of relief from the suffering we've been experiencing. And we can be validated very quickly. Most of us are validated very quickly at some level in our pursuit of this practice. And here, in some ways, it's we're getting something. We're getting something we didn't have before. We're replacing previous drivers and accomplishments and states and experiences with other ones that are actually proving to be deeper and more fulfilling. And then practice matures. Something shifts. In the middle stages of practice, and I'm offering this now as an observation, you know, not as a prescription, or not as a definition, you know, like, oh, I must be in the middle stages of practice because I feel that way, because all of these things tend to permeate at all times. But as a general observation, there is a period when someone is practicing for, you know, in that 3 to 7, 8 year time frame, when the initial recognitions and shifts that you experience in the first years of practice are not happening as dramatically, if at all. And so the form of motivation that kind of initiated your practice and fueled it at the beginning, hopefully it takes a bit of a shift, and you become actually more motivated by what you are letting go. You find the things that you're no longer experiencing to be very gratifying and satisfying. You find silence to be more satisfying than words. We take joy in being simple. We take joy in saying less. We take joy in creating less karma. We might not necessarily put it that way, but maybe we do. It's a very much of a less is more kind of mindset. And there's a profound satisfaction in living in this. Now, if we don't take the shift and we keep thinking that there's something wrong with that, our practice can be really hindered at this point, right? Because we want it to be more about constant insight and shift. People might even feel bored in their practice at this point, or unmotivated. But that's a risk area. That's kind of that can become a dead end. That can become a little eddy in the current of your practice. My teacher Shishimaroshi painted a picture of the current of your practice like being like a stream. And if you watch a stream, sometimes there's that little part on the side where the water, goes down and it sort of gets trapped in a little bit of it could be a little stagnant area or a little whirlpool, cycle around, and it can just end up like that. That's a risk in our practice. You really want to maintain the discipline of our practice so that we actually recognize the subtle layers of consciousness that we're uncovering within ourselves. And we continue to establish the bedrock basis of our presence. Then it matures even more. It matures into our bodhisattva vows, where we really aspire to facilitate the realization of all beings, right? To receive all sentient beings, to dissolve all delusions, to enter all dharma gates, to manifest the Buddha way. This becomes a very clear and present motivation. We've come to see that there is no fundamental separation between us and all beings. So in helping other beings, we're helping each other in the same way that one hand helps the other. Right? And this comes from a lived recognition of that. In the early stages of our practice, we have a sense of that, but we don't have it fully internalized, fully recognized. So we hold it as a vow to deepen our understanding of it as we're practicing it. Right? But as our practice matures, it becomes something that we actually realize that we're doing. In helping others, we help ourselves, and in helping ourselves, we're helping others. So Dogen, in his essay on this, it says, in Buddhism, the ultimate attainment is Bodhi, which is Buddhahood, so Buddha mind. If the highest perfect enlightenment is compared with the initial arousing of the thought of enlightenment, it's like comparing the great conflagration at the time of the world's end with the light of a firefly. So Bodhi mind is the conflagration at the end of the world, and the initial arousing of the thought of enlightenment is the light of a firefly. They're both light, yeah? Still, if one arouses the thought of enlightenment, the thought of emancipating all other living beings, even before one has emancipated oneself, there is no difference between the two. A Buddha is simply a person who thinks, how can I cause beings to enter the supreme Dharma and rapidly become Buddhas? This is the life of a Tathagata. So there's something very, very interesting about the way Dogen kind of expands on this. He says, so arousing the thought of enlightenment isn't just making a determination to enlighten all beings, but it's the determination to motivate all living beings, to motivate all living beings. On and on. it's an interesting way to actually look at this, which I hadn't quite appreciated until recently. And I like it very much. Instead of the bodhisattva being motivated by helping other beings attain Buddhahood, we're actually motivating them to motivate other beings, because attaining Buddhahood is raising the Bodhi mind for us all to awaken together. Because we can't awaken individually. It's impossible. So this dimension, I think, enters in the early stages, perhaps as a glimmer. We sense something of this truth, I think, early on. I think children, have a sense of this, that when their intrinsic generosity comes up, this no separation. So all of this is present all the time. I think it's really helpful to reflect on this, frequently. Where is your motivation? Especially if you're feeling unmotivated. Yeah, to remind yourself, where is the motivation? Yeah. This is a very precious opportunity we have in this human life, and a precious opportunity having been exposed to the Dharma, and then to have the opportunity to practice with Sangha and teachers and teachings, to develop in this way, and not to waste your time and waste your life pursuing these false goals, these impermanent illusions that are put up by our myths and our social structures as being the valuable aspects of our life, the things worth pursuing. But it's always important to be willing to sacrifice, one path, or even an arm, like Eka did when he came to Bodhidharma, just to make sacrifices for the pursuit of your true path. But if you're sacrificing wealth and reputation and all of those false gods, then you're not really sacrificing much. Keeping the flame alive, is very important. So as we enter into our Ango period next month, it'll be an opportunity to refresh your motivation, tune in to what has brought you to practice, what brings you to practice. Really hear and listen to the teachings and to the precepts that are offered forth as the guide rails, for this practice, and see how they resonate in your own heart. I'm extremely grateful for the Dharma. Extremely grateful. Okay, I'll conclude there.